Welcome to this lesson. In our previous lesson, we looked at Introduction to Integrated Science. In this lesson, we are going to look at the scientific method. At the end of the lesson, you should be able to describe the scientific method, list the steps involved in the scientific method, and also apply the scientific method to solve problems. Now, what is the scientific method? So, as the word implies, we know that it has to do with science, and the word method in there shows that it has to do with a systematic way of doing things, because of course we know that one of the things we look out for in English or essay writing, a part of the areas that you are scored on is the methodology, and that refers to the different processes or steps that you take to develop your essay in a chronological manner or order. Similarly, the method in here also shows that the scientist would have to follow a sequence of steps from A to B, then to C, all the way to the last point. What then is it? The scientific method is largely a mathematical and an experimental technique. So the two key words in there is it's got a mathematical component, and we'll see why shortly. It is also very experimental. And is employed by scientists to solve problems. Now, there are different ways of addressing problems or solving problems scientifically, but the scientific method has been shown to be one of the best ways of solving problems, because then it yields results that have been tried and tested, and inferences made from the results gathered using the scientific method are much more effective than some other methods that are being used. Now let's look at the various steps that are involved in the scientific method. First, you identify the problem. So the scientist looks around and identifies a particular problem of interest. So for example, scientists might be wondering why people who live around a certain water body or with bushes growing around tend to develop malaria more frequently than people who live in urban settlements with well-fenced, proper accommodations, and more decent homes. So that is a problem the scientists must have identified. So to begin with, we'll continue by stating the aim of the experiment. So the aim will be to determine or to evaluate, and these are words we use when we are stating the aim. So you can write to determine or to evaluate or to assess, okay, or to, in the case of to determine, you might want to compare why people living in rural or slum settlements tend to develop malaria more than people in well-developed communities or in urban settlements. Then the scientist goes on to formulate a hypothesis. So the hypothesis is largely just a statement that is made and remains unanswered, and is a statement that usually gets to be proven as true or false, as accurate or inaccurate at the end of the experiment. So the scientist can make a hypothesis that people who live in slum or dwellings or slum settlements are more prone to developing the malaria, maybe because they lack some things that would have fought the disease within their body, or any such thing. Just a statement that the the researcher would aim to either accept or reject, or prove or otherwise at the end of the experiment. Then the scientist goes on to read and observe. So the scientist would have to read literature, others who have done a similar work or conducted a similar research or similar experiment in times past. And then you read and compare, what have these people gathered? What have they, deductions did they make? So that the current experiment that the researcher would do will just go to add on to what previous scientists or researchers have done. That also gives the researcher more information and a proper understanding of the problem at hand. Then it goes on to plan the investigation. Which tools is he or she going to use? What will be the sample size? What type of instrument is it going to use to conduct the research? What type of data collection or sampling method will he or she use? When would he carry out the work? When is the work going to end? How long is he going to spend on the field if he's going to go out into the field to get data? All these things would have to be planned before the researcher carries out the experiment. Then after planning the investigation, he can now go on to carry out the experimentation. If it's a field work, he then goes out into the field either to ask questions or do the practical assessments of the problem. If it's a lab work, then he conducts experiments within the laboratory setting. Eventually, he's supposed to record data collected, either on the field or in the lab, or giving questionnaires to people to answer. In either case, the data collected would have to be interpreted. So in interpreting the data, there may be the need to carry out further experiments. But if there's no need to carry out further experiments, then the data collected will be evaluated and inferences will be made for the data to analyze and draw conclusions from the data. It is at this point that the hypothesis can either be accepted or rejected, and conclusions and inferences made, giving a thorough understanding and, in most cases, proffering solutions to the problem. Now, the assignment at the end of this lesson: briefly describe how you would use the scientific method to solve a problem you have identified in your community. All right, in this lesson, we looked at the scientific method. We mentioned that it involves a mathematical and experimental way that scientists adopt to solve problems. And it has a large number of steps, starting from identifying the problem to evaluating and making inferences or drawing conclusions from any data that has been recorded and interpreted. In our next lesson, we're going to look at measurements. See you in the next lesson.